You sure it's not those? Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
And we're adjusting our thinking to the new type of enemy.
Days after the 9/11 attacks, President George W. Bush launched the global war on terror. In October 2001,
Guys, they told
he
us
sent
not.
the military to invade Afghanistan and hunt down members of al-Qaeda and its ally, the Taliban. It also offered cash rewards to anyone who would help capture a terrorist, often enough money to change lives. So many in Afghanistan and Pakistan took advantage of this offer and turned hundreds of men over, often with little evidence. The US then sent those men to secret prisons called black sites, where they interrogated and tortured them. But within a month, they started searching for a larger, permanent prison to consolidate all these prisoners, eventually settling on this old Navy base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
Wait. This is a question, chat. Yes, was the embargo lifted in those years or not? Was it? Was it lifted? It was not, right?
In January 2002, the first detainees began arriving. One of them was Moath al-Alawi, who spent the next 2 decades in this prison because the US government deemed him too dangerous to be set free. But they never charged him with a crime, and he's not alone. Hundreds of men were imprisoned in Guantanamo. Few were charged with a crime, some were tortured, and none received a fair trial. It's a prison that's operated outside the bounds of law. So how did the US get away with this? And why is Guantanamo Bay still open?
Is there any toes or no toes?
There are two myths about the people who were picked up. One is that they are all hardened, capable terrorists. The other is that they were all innocent shepherds.
This is Dan Freed. He worked in the US Foreign Service for over 40 years and was assigned to Guantanamo in 2009.
Yes, back in the days, okay, the US had an embargo, so like a no trade thing with Cuba, but Canada didn't, right? So it's actually a really cool, cheap, nice place to go to vacation, and everybody from where I'm from, everybody would go to vacation in Cuba, and it was kind of cool. I actually went once.
The conclusion I had is there was kind of a bell curve. At one low end, there were actually hardened terrorists.
Like this man, Osama bin Laden's personal secretary.
There were others that were sometimes petty criminals and drug dealers, not great people, but not criminal masterminds, not terrorists. And the top of the bell curve were people just a little more involved than what I just described. At the other end were people who were swept up and shouldn't have been there at all.
Like a group of Uyghur men, members of a mainly Muslim ethnic group who were fleeing persecution in China.
And they wound up in al-Qaeda camps, and we didn't know what to do with them, and so they ended up in Guantanamo.
In fact, many detainees were put in Guantanamo based on little evidence, yet Bush officials often described them all as terrorists.
I mean, these are people that would gnaw through hydraulic lines in the back of a C-17 to bring it down. Very, very dangerous people.
By 2003, there were nearly 700 Guantanamo detainees, and virtually none of them were charged with a crime.
The American flag flies again over our embassy in Kabul. Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay.
The Bush administration chose Guantanamo Bay largely because of its unique location. It was under US control, but it wasn't technically inside the US, so they claimed US law wouldn't apply to the detainees held here. If they put them in a US prison, they'd have to either charge them with a crime and put them on trial, or release them. In other words, under US law, prisoners would have ways to get out.
For bad reasons, they didn't trust the criminal justice system. It gives too many rights to prisoners. There was a sense that the old rules had to be thrown out.
I'm not saying anything.
The US also claimed that international law didn't apply to these detainees either, even though 196 countries, including the US, signed the Geneva Conventions, a set of laws protecting...
Guys, if we sometimes forget about the context, okay, and we just try it, this is just it's not my opinion, it's a question almost, okay, and you forget the context and you just go, okay, black on white, is it a good thing that the government, I feel like, I'm asking, okay, is kind of using a loophole, and then they're talking about it publicly or whatever, and it's like, yeah, guys, we're using a loophole, and everybody is clapping and applauding. I don't know how I feel overall that as a concept. That as a concept, I think it's odd. I think it's an odd thing. I think it's odd.
Prisoners of war. But for those laws to apply, the US would have to define the detainees as prisoners of war. Then they couldn't interrogate them and would have to release them as soon as the conflict ends.
It's about perception. It's all about perception, you know? I feel like as an individual, you see the people that are above you telling you the rules, the laws, what to do, what not to do, right? Then they do something, right? And then they kind of like, oh, guys, look, guys, we're having these people in a loophole. And you're like, okay, well, I mean, I feel like it's like, okay, then why don't I do a loophole then? Why don't we do all do loopholes?
We didn't want to give them those rights. Because we were so fearful of a new terrorist attack, we wanted to interrogate. And frankly, some parts of the U.S. government interrogated through torture. I mean, that's fact.
So instead of charging them as criminals or calling them prisoners of war, the U.S. made up a new term. Unlawful enemy combatants.
It's a bad take? Okay, sorry.
The U.S. claimed it could hold unlawful enemy combatants without charges in Guantanamo indefinitely, and the detainees couldn't challenge it in court. But the U.S. could prosecute them in a new court system run entirely by the military. These courts were designed to be complex, with rules that heavily favored the U.S. government. For example, the government could introduce evidence without showing it to the detainee first. This made Guantanamo Bay Prison a legal black hole.
The original sin is that we created an institution outside and designed to be outside the rule of law.
No more torture in our name! And shut it down and release everybody.
Justice for Guantanamo detainees, now a cause célèbre among human rights activists.
World leaders, allied governments, and U.S. politicians began calling for the closure of Guantanamo. Plus, Bush officials recognized that it was actually hurting the war on terror.
Gitmo was also a great recruiting tool. There were all these terrorist videos about how evil the Americans were, and we have to fight back because they imprison people without any legal basis. They torture people.
Eventually, the Supreme Court stepped in. In a series of decisions, the court ruled that Guantanamo detainees were entitled to challenge their imprisonment in court. It was clear the U.S. would soon have to let many of these detainees out. So the Bush administration reviewed every case and set up a transfer process.
Pretty simple process, yeah. Move them back, mainly to Afghanistan. Nobody asked a lot of questions.
Over a 5-year period, the Bush administration transferred 532 detainees and only convicted 3 through the military courts. 5 detainees died in the prison. 4 of them were reportedly suicides.
Wait, what? Wait, only 3 were convicted? And on top of that, it was kind of like, it was rigged?
Courts. 5 detainees died in the prison. 4 of them were reportedly suicides. That left 242 in Guantanamo when he left office, with some hope that the prison would close.
Guantanamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now.
On his second day in office, Barack Obama signed an executive order to close Guantanamo within a year. His administration split the detainees into 3 groups and laid out a plan with more paths out. The first group included about half the detainees, who would be transferred either to their home countries, or for those whose home countries were too dangerous or unstable, the U.S. would negotiate deals with other countries to take them. Or they'd be released to the U.S. This was the plan for the Uyghur Men. A second group would be tried as criminals in a U.S. federal court, including 5 men who helped plan the 9/11 attacks. But that still left a third group.
There was a category of people we didn't feel comfortable transferring, but without sufficient evidentiary basis to put them on trial.
This final group of several dozen would be moved to a super maximum security prison in Illinois. Then Guantanamo could be closed.
It was a good enough plan. It had risk, but keeping Guantanamo open has risks too.
Now, I believe that any plan to close Guantanamo that includes bringing these terrorists into the United States, Mr. President, is a mistake.
To do so would be nothing short of an invitation for al-Qaeda to operate inside our homeland.
In my view, these men are exactly where they belong.
In Congress, Republican politicians fiercely opposed every aspect of the plan. They pushed back against transfers and putting any detainees on trial in the U.S.
It will make America a more dangerous place, and it will allow them the platform to spew their hateful ideology.
They even attacked the plan to move some into the Supermax prison.
You're also putting people who would then start plotting for their escape from the outside in America's neighborhoods.
But all of a sudden when Obama comes in, oh no, you can't let people go because you're letting terrorists out.
What?
The spring of '09, this narrative was already set. Obama administration, soft on terrorism. It's fair to ask tough questions. What's not reasonable is making it impossible for Obama when you didn't ask any hard questions about Bush.
Ultimately, both Republicans and Democrats passed bills that blocked any Guantanamo detainee from coming to the U.S. for any reason, including for trial, imprisonment, or release. Then the Obama administration folded.
They gave up at the first sign that it would take a lot of political capital to close Gitmo. But y'all made a big deal of it, so you better mean it.
What is
the
this video? What's the
Obama
video?
administration didn't mean it enough.
The only two options detainees had stayed in place but got much harder. The military courts were extremely slow and ineffective. 3 convictions had been overturned by 2016, and transfers became more complicated. Many of the detainees were from Yemen, but couldn't be transferred back after conflict broke out there in 2011. So the U.S. would have to convince other countries to take them.
Chat.
That was Dan's job.
For years and years, the American government has said, these are the worst of the worst. These are terrorist masterminds. And now I'm saying, no, they're actually not. We shouldn't have asked other countries to take them if we weren't willing to take them.
Dan negotiated transfers for 17 Uyghur men who were not allowed to be released to the U.S. They'd been held in Guantanamo for more than a decade. Over 8 years, the Obama administration moved 197 detainees out of Guantanamo and convicted 5 through the military courts. 4 more died inside, 3 reportedly from suicide. That left 41 detainees with a new president who wanted to keep the prison open.
We're going to keep, as you know, Gitmo, we're keeping that open, and we're going to load it up with bad dudes.
In 2017, Donald Trump took office as a fervent supporter of keeping Guantanamo open. In 4 years, his administration only transferred out 1 detainee. In 2021, when President Biden took office, Moath al-Alawi had been in Guantanamo for 19 years. According to his testimony, he went on a series of hunger strikes to protest his detention and described his life as an endless horror movie. But on January 11, 2022, Biden approved Alawi and 4 others for transfer. For Guantanamo to close, the Biden administration needs to transfer the last remaining detainees. And the military courts need to conclude trials for the 10 who are currently stuck in the system, including the 5 alleged 9/11 plotters who have been on trial for a decade.
Once you start them outside the rule of law, bringing them in the rule of law is a lot trickier than you think. Don't throw out the rule book in a fit of passion. You'll regret it. We did.
Interesting. Guys, it's Vox, so I always try to, some of the things that are more factual, kind of look at it, and some of the things that are more, I'm not gonna say anything. You get it though. It's Vox.